You may recall that on the day he was sworn in, President Trump signed an executive order, effectively stopping any refugees from being allowed to come and resettle in the United States. Now, there's an act passed by Congress called the Refugee Act, which allows for as many as 125,000 refugees in this fiscal year, people who can prove they're being persecuted or fear persecution because of race or religion or political beliefs. And nowhere near that number has been allowed in by the time Mr. Trump took office and shut it all down. But just a few weeks later, President Trump announced that he was making an exception, and not only that, he would expedite the processing of refugee claims by one group of people from Africa. Now, you might think it's some women and children who've been maybe sexually assaulted in the conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, a place that's seen fighting for decades. On this program, we reported on the violence, the plight of people there in a series of programs in 2006.
What has gone on here is simply extraordinary. Over the last 10 years here, there has been major fighting between a number of different groups. It has been the deadliest war in our lifetime, the deadliest war since World War II. Some 3 to 4 million people have died in this country, and their deaths have virtually gone unnoticed.
And there's a whole new round of fighting that's been going on in eastern Congo between the government and an armed group called M23. Thousands have died, hundreds of thousands displaced, and widespread reports of sexual violence against women. But President Trump hasn't allowed refugees from there here, nor from Sudan, where there's been terrible fighting. The only Africans President Trump has paved a quick path for are these South Africans. And yes, they are white. They are Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch settlers to South Africa. This is the first group of people granted refugee status to enter the U.S. since the president entered his second term. On February 7th, President Trump signed this executive order carving out an exception for the Afrikaners, the white minority who created the racist apartheid regime in South Africa and ruled there cruelly and brutally until 1994. When black South Africans, the overwhelming majority of South Africans, were allowed to vote for the first time, and they voted for that man, Nelson Mandela. Afrikaners took land from black people in South Africa, repressed them, and in the 3 decades since the end of apartheid, they still have all the land they took. Black South Africans, who make up over 80% of the population, still only own around 4% of private land. Now, President Trump was asked why these Afrikaners were allowed to enter the U.S.
Why are you creating an expedited path into the country for Afrikaners but not others?
Because they're being killed, and we don't want to see people be killed. It's a genocide that's taking place that you people don't want to write about, but it's a terrible thing that's taking place, and farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me, but white farmers are being brutally killed, and their land is being confiscated in South Africa. And the newspapers and the media, television media, doesn't even talk about it. If it were the other way around, they'd talk about it. That would be the only story they'd talk about. And I don't care who they are. I don't care about their race, their color. I don't care about their height, their weight. I don't care about anything. I just know that what's happening is terrible. I have people that live in South Africa. They say it's a terrible situation taking place. So we've essentially extended citizenship to those people to escape from that violence and come here.
The idea that there's a genocide of white farmers going on in South Africa is just not true. It's absurd. And that's been debunked by a number of organizations, both inside and outside of South Africa. But it's become a rallying cry for the some right-wing elements inside the country, and has echoed all the way to America. Let me just go back to Sudan for a moment. An actual genocide has happened there, according to the U.S., as 2 warring factions battled for control of that country earlier this year. The U.S. accused one side, the RSF, of committing genocide. More than 11 million people have been internally displaced, while millions more have fled the country. That's according to the UN. They aren't allowed to be refugees here. And on top of this, the Afghans who worked alongside U.S. troops during the war as interpreters and guides and fixers, Afghans who fought for the United States, helped save American lives, and were allowed here under a temporary protected status. Well, now we learn that status is not going to be renewed next week, according to the Department of Homeland Security, which means many who helped save U.S. lives may be deported starting in July. Joining us now is New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof. Nick, you say this whole situation upside down. The idea that there's a genocide of white farmers. I mean, why do you think the Trump administration is doing this?
Well, I mean, he's completely turned refugee policy upside down in ways that reflect racial discrimination. I mean, he's not, the Afrikaner farmers are not suffering from that. It is true that some have been murdered, but black farmers have been murdered at even higher rates. And
Right,
if
there's
you
a
looked
huge
around
crime
the
rate.
world at the,
Crime rate in South Africa. Crime is a huge problem, but according to organizations there's been no forcible taking back of confiscation of land at this point.
Not at all. And, it is true that there was legislation passed in January that theoretically creates an opportunity to confiscate some land without compensation. That has not been implemented. Nobody has had their land taken away. And, these Afrikaners are among the most privileged people on the entire continent. They are they are assets, or the white South Africans have assets 20 times greater than those of black South Africans on average. And, you just mentioned Sudan, the world's probably worst humanitarian crisis right now. In Sudan, I've seen a man who had his eyes gouged out as a reflection of that genocide with a bayonet. In Congo, which you also mentioned, I saw children who were gang raped because of their ethnicity. That is the world's worst mass atrocity since World War II. In Myanmar, I talked to a Rohingya mom who had her baby pulled from her arms and thrown into a bonfire. That is plausibly a genocide. But none of those people have any right to be accepted to come to the U.S. as refugees. And instead, we bring in, a group of people who don't remotely qualify as refugees. But what distinguishes them is that they are white. And as the son of a refugee, I just find this makes a mockery of the entire principle of refugee status.
Also, the U.S. actually cut off its economic assistance to South Africa over this as well. So it's not just not letting black South Africans in or other people from other parts of the continent. There's now a cutoff of aid for HIV medication. I think South Africa gets about 17% of their of the money that they use for HIV treatment in South Africa comes from the U.S.
And that, as you know, has happened across the continent, that there are kids dying right now across the African continent because they can't get emergency food aid, which costs maybe $70 to save a child's life, because they can't get AIDS medication, which costs 12 cents a day. We can't afford that, but we were willing, America was, to provide a plane to bring 49 Afrikaners, white privileged Afrikaners, to the United States and give them expedited refugee status, when meanwhile there are 12,000 other people who have already been approved and gone through a multi-year screening and have flights booked. In some cases, these Afghans who saved the lives of American troops, and now they're held off, and we're not admitting them.